When performing a migration into SharePoint Online or OneDrive, there's more to consider than just source and destination. Things like conflict resolution with your content, permissions migration, list and library settings. All of these considerations have to be answered. In Fly, you make decisions based on all of those different settings and options in what's known as a migration policy. To create a migration policy for your migrations, we log into Fly, and over on the left we go to Migration Settings to Migration Policy. You can create a migration policy for various sources, but please note that the migration policies you create are for migrating into that particular type of connection. So if I'm going to be migrating into SharePoint or OneDrive, I want to create a SharePoint migration policy. Every type also comes with an out-of-the-box default migration policy, which you can review but cannot edit. So if you would like to make some of your own choices, then you have to create a brand new migration policy. To do that, we click on Create. In the slide out on the right, we give it a name and an optional description if necessary. We then scroll down and start making decisions. The first thing we come to is conflict resolution. Under conflict resolution, you have container level, which is either skip or merge. Containers are folders within lists and libraries themselves as well. And then below that, we have content level, which has skip, overwrite, overwrite by modified time, which is different from the migration point, and append. With container level, if you choose skip, if there are two folders in a library with exactly the same name, then the migrating folder will not be migrated. It will be left out. If you choose merge, the content within those folders will be put together in the destination. At that point, you would look down to your content level, and that's where things like skip, overwrite, and the others we listed become important. If you then have two files within that folder with the same name, skip will leave out the migrating file. If you were to choose something like append, for instance, append means keep both files even though they have the same name, and the migrating file, the file that is coming in, will have a number 1 added to its end. The idea there is then you make decisions on which ones to keep at a later time. Once you've made decisions on your conflict resolution, the next thing below that is filters and mappings. We have another video on creating a filter policy, so please go and view that. But the basic idea of a filter policy is you can dictate what content should be migrated from the site collection level all the way down to the document level. So as an example, if I was to go down to document, you can see I can look at various types of metadata on individual files. And I could dictate, for instance, based on the last time that something was accessed, the last time that something was modified, for instance. And I could set a date for that. So the idea is that the filter policy would only locate, say, documents that have been modified within the last 3 years, and then that is what would be migrated. Anything older would be left out. And again, you can do that at various levels here. Now, of course, keep in mind, if you are migrating in from a different source, something like a file system or even from G Drive, well then you won't have site collections to migrate in, or even sites or lists or libraries. You'll be working essentially at folder, item, and document levels. Below the filter policy, we then have a few types of mappings. User mappings allow you to map one user to another. The idea there is, if I come in here and do a user mapping, I could put in John Smith and map him over to, let's say, Sue Jones. Anything that says John Smith in the source will map over to Sue Jones in the destination. This is great if you want to change ownership of your content. If you do decide to employ user mappings, you then have to tell it how you want it to match those users, based on names, display names, email addresses. You can move these properties around in the hierarchy if you use more than one, by clicking on the various arrows that we have here. Scrolling down, we have additional mappings. First is column mappings. Column mappings, as their name implies, allows you to map a source column to a destination column. So as an example, in my source A list column is called product name, but in our destination, we want that to just be called product. In addition to that, we can even add value mappings below that. When you do value mappings, you're telling it find this value in that source column and change it to this value in that destination column, and you can do as many of those as you need to. The idea with something like that is it means you don't have to clean up the data in the source before you migrate, nor do you have to migrate bad data and then clean it up later. You can transform the data as it's actually moving. You even have the ability to change the value of the column's type. You can see that the default is same type, but we also have change to destination. So if this was a single line and this was, say, a choice list, where you would pick values from a dropdown, as an example. There's a third option in there, change to label. This is if you're using Office 365 retention labels. Below column mapping is content type mapping. Content type mapping, as its name implies, allows you to map a source content type to a destination content type. So for instance, in our source, we were using the document content type for a bunch of files that are being migrated, but in the destination, we've created a custom content type that we call secure docs, and I want everything previously labeled as document to now receive the secure docs content type. Again, do it during the migration and not after. Below content type mapping, the last mapping that we have here is template mapping. Template mapping would allow you on a site level or on a list and library level to change the template of a particular object. If I click on Add Mapping under List Template, you can then see that we can scroll down and see the various kinds of lists that are available in SharePoint Online. Maybe I built some custom lists in my source and I want to remove those customizations, so I'm going to just change those custom lists back to a standard, let's say, announcements list, for instance. Of course, this takes a lot of planning in the pre-migration stages. You want to really have a good handle on what kind of lists you're dealing with, because if you have a bunch of different custom lists that are all doing different things, then you don't necessarily just want to map custom to something else. You can also go into SharePoint, you can find those template ID numbers, in which case you can come in here and you can actually just type them directly yourself if you prefer to do that. Below the different types of mappings, we then have settings that are going to be migrated. You can see apps, subsites, content, site and list columns, site and list content types, and others. If you decided that you didn't want to migrate something, you simply uncheck that. Now again, this assumes that these are things that are coming over from the source. As I mentioned earlier, keep in mind, if you're migrating into SharePoint Online or into OneDrive from an outside source like G Drive or Box, and these things do not exist, then that particular setting will simply be ignored. On the list level settings and different views, both public and private views created by your users. Scrolling down, do we want to attempt to pull in any profile properties from that source environment? And do we want to attempt to migrate any permissions, site, list, and content? If I was planning on doing something like, say, a G Drive migration, I'm not going to have site level properties for permissions that I need to worry about. Are there workflows? And do you want those workflow definitions migrated? Again, if it's not a SharePoint source, then maybe workflows is not something I need to worry about. And then finally, a specific setting for OneDrive for Business, migrate the documents library for OneDrive. That means don't bring anything else, only the documents library, which in the case of OneDrives is where your users perform most of their work. That's where they keep all of their stuff, in there and then in subfolders. If there are other libraries and lists that have been created in there though, they will be left out if this is checked. Once everything looks good, down at the bottom we click Save. We can see that the migration policy is now available to us and is ready to be used in a SharePoint or OneDrive migration plan. Thanks for watching this short video on creating an Office 365 SharePoint Online and OneDrive migration policy.